In the depths of the human soul, where shadows dance with fear and whispers echo the secrets of the night, lies a tale shrouded in darkness. Prepare to journey into the heart of horror, where reality and nightmare intertwine. Welcome, brave souls, to Unraveling Darkness, a realm where the lines between the living and the dead blur, and the truth hides behind a veil of terror. Take heed, because once you enter, there's no turning back. Dare you confront the horrors that lie within? Brace yourselves, for the nightmare begins now. Before this story begins, I must tell you that the voodoo priest this story is about has since been arrested. During a raid on his home, authorities found an altar with 3 mummified baby corpses, 2 of which were inside large plastic dolls. In the home of his then-girlfriend, Myrte, they also found the corpse of a baby. The one who filed the complaint against the voodoo priest, Andreas, was her daughter, Fabiola. Myrte struggled with mental issues and visited Andreas seeking help. But instead of assisting her, he suddenly became her boyfriend. Long story short, Andreas drained her completely and ensured she no longer cared for her children, cutting ties with them entirely so he could have free rein to do as he pleased with her. I should note that this Andreas comes from a feared witchcraft family, comprising a total of 10 brothers, all practicing witchcraft. That's enough background information for now. Let's delve into my personal experience with this demonic man, Andreas. Coincidentally, my daughter's apartment was above Myrtha's. My daughter, Latifah, lived on the 3rd floor, while Myrtha was on the 2nd. Latifah was painting when she heard a blood-curdling scream. With all her windows and doors open, it was clearly audible. She dropped her brush on a newspaper and rushed downstairs. Upon reaching the bottom, she saw Fabiola, Myrtha's daughter, outside her mother's apartment, crying and staring in shock at the doorway. Fabiola wouldn't stop screaming. She was inconsolable, so Latifah slapped her to snap her out of it. Then she ran into the apartment to see what was happening. When she opened the door and stood in the hallway, she saw Fabiola's mother dead on the couch. Later, I asked her why she went inside. Latifah said, "I wanted to check her pulse, but the closer I got to that woman, the harder it became to approach her. It was as if something was holding me back. Suddenly, I felt a punch to my stomach, as if someone had hit me with incredible force. Latifah retreated and took Fabiola across to the neighbors to call the police, because my daughter didn't have a phone as she had just moved. Latifah informed the neighbors that Fabiola had just discovered her dead mother in her apartment and asked them to call the police. In her hysteria, Fabiola also mentioned between sobs that she was sure Andreas, her mother's boyfriend, was the one who murdered her mother. She also revealed that Andreas had raped her. Fabiola advised her to report the man to the police immediately, but she simply couldn't muster the courage because she was terrified of Andreas. Eventually, the report was filed under pressure from my daughter, leading to Andreas's arrest, and the baby corpses were found with him and later at Fabiola's mother's home. After filing her report, Fabiola was taken in by her sister. Myrti was financially well off while she was alive. She was a widow, and her husband had left her financially secure. However, Andreas had taken all her money, and Myrta was about to report it before her death. A week after Myrthe was found dead in her home, 3 of Andreas's brothers came to my daughter's house. Now, I must mention that my sister has a child with one of Andreas's brothers. My daughter thought this brother was her nephew's father because some of the brothers looked exactly alike. So she kindly opened the door for them. Once inside, 2 brothers held her in the kitchen, blocking her from leaving, while the other brother snooped around the house. They asked, "What did you see? Tell us now. What did you see?" My daughter was completely shocked and replied, "What do you mean? What did I see? I didn't see anything. I only saw Fabiola at the door." They said nothing and left the house without explanation. Some time passed, and my daughter began having strange dreams. Dreams of unfamiliar people constantly smiling at her, and an elderly woman who seemed to be warning her. Whenever she walked somewhere, the elderly woman would glare at her angrily and point out that she shouldn't be there. These dreams persisted, but my daughter didn't think much of them. Sometime later, my daughter got a new job. After a few days, she called me and said she couldn't concentrate at work. She was making constant mistakes she wouldn't normally make, and sometimes she seemed to speak gibberish. This was strange for my daughter, as she was highly educated and usually very meticulous. Things worsened for my daughter, and she decided to resign from her job months later. I thought it was just exhaustion, unaware that demonic entities were at work, ruining my daughter's life. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to leave a like. This helps us grow, so we can continue posting weekly stories. Let's get back to the story. I noticed she no longer went out with friends, hardly spoke anymore, and at one point, she began walking around her house, naked. She stood bewildered at my mother's door, her grandmother, with a large pot full of loose change. When my mother opened the door, she ran inside, hid behind the couch, and said the mafia was after her. Someone needed to help her now, because they were coming to get her. My mother could clearly see that something was not right with her granddaughter, and tried to approach her. However, as she got closer, Latifah ran to the balcony as if she wanted to jump off. My father tried to stop her, and Latifah hit him hard on the head with the pot full of change and ran out the front door. My parents called me and told me we needed to come immediately because something was seriously wrong with Latifah. I asked where she was, and they said she had run back home as she lived near my mother. My husband and I drove to Latifah, and once we arrived, she was again naked in her house. We were quite fed up with Latifah's behavior at this point and started to think she was using drugs. We looked for signs of drug use on her body, but found nothing. Latifah looked at my husband and whispered in his ear, "Daddy, there are little men running around the house trying to catch me, but I'm smart, so they can't find me. When I take my clothes off, they can't see me, and I'm invisible." My husband wasn't familiar with the voodoo world, so he frantically searched the house for little men, but found nothing, of course. We decided to call my daughter's boyfriend and asked him how long this had been going on. It was clear that things were not well with Latifah, and we were afraid she needed psychological help. He said she had been like this for several weeks. We were very angry because we couldn't understand why he didn't think to call her parents. If someone is doing so badly, you seek help, don't you? It doesn't seem normal for someone to constantly walk around naked in the house and say crazy things. We decided to take Latifah home, but things went completely wrong there. Once home, She said she was tired and wanted to sleep. We hadn't prepared a room because we didn't expect to bring her home. Latifah then decided to lie down on the couch and fell asleep. My husband and I were shocked by what we had just experienced and discussed it in the kitchen afterward. It was around midnight when Latifah suddenly got up and ran outside. My husband wanted to run after her, but he tripped before reaching the door and fell hard to the ground. By the time he got up, Latifah had disappeared, and we couldn't find her anywhere. We lived in a village, and my children had many friends, so everyone was looking for her. Eventually, a colleague of my husband found her sitting in the woods. We took Latifah home and asked her what she was doing there, and told her she had made us very worried. Latifah didn't speak a word from that moment on, and she didn't speak for months. We went to doctors, care institutions, and psychiatrists, but no one could figure out what was wrong. Latifah simply didn't speak anymore. I was at my wit's end, fell to my knees again, and cried, "God, please help me one more time to find the right person." I had no money left. My parents and I had pawned all our jewelry because we constantly sought help that we had to pay dearly for. We were literally broke. You won't believe this, but I decided to go to the casino with $100 and test my luck. Because I had felt that hand, I had a feeling that this time it would be okay, and it was. I won the jackpot of $32,000. I was so happy that I gave tips to people around me and bought tickets for my husband, Latifah, and myself to our homeland the same day. This is because I knew that there might be better help there. We are from Haiti, and their voodoo is more active. My daughter didn't eat, didn't speak, and always stood like a statue. If you were sleeping, she would come into your room and just stare at you in the middle of the night. She no longer functioned like a normal person. No work, no friends. It was as if she was a little child again. If I didn't tell her to go to the bathroom, she wouldn't. I literally had to tell her everything, and nothing came from her own initiative. Our trip to Haiti, once we arrived, we stayed with my cousin, and from there we looked for help for Latifah. However, people realized we were from a rich country, so we were soon told that help would cost thousands of euros. Things were also bad with Latifah in our homeland. Sometimes she would jump out of the window and run into the street. The strange thing about all this was that the dogs would chase after us, but never after Latifah. When she decided to run away again, the dogs would start barking, but they would stay in the yard. On a particular day, I visited a relative where coincidentally, the in-laws were also visiting. The in-laws came from a village across the river and were very traditional. The father-in-law looked at Latifah and asked what was wrong with her. He felt she had a dark vibe and immediately sensed that something was seriously amiss. I explained that we had come seeking help, and he mentioned that he might know someone who could assist. However, we would have to accompany him to his village because this person never leaves the village and only helps if brought by someone from the village. By this point, I was accustomed to such matters costing a lot of money, so I asked immediately what I should bring in terms of money. He looked at me in shock and said that helping people doesn't cost money. Only devilish people ask for money. After everything is done, you can decide if you want to support the village with a donation, but you don't have to give money to the helper. We made an appointment, and the next day, we departed by boat to the man's village. Upon arriving in the village, an elderly lady sat opposite us, tears welling up in her eyes. She asked why we had come only now and why we had left Latifah like that for so long. She could see that Latifah's soul was tired and no longer wanted to fight. This somehow gave me a good feeling because I hoped and thought we had finally arrived at the right place. We had to walk to a spot in the village, about 500 meters away, when Latifah sat down on the ground after taking the first steps and refused to continue walking. We couldn't get her off the ground, and she seemed to have become extremely heavy. The man who would help us laughed and said we shouldn't worry. This always happens when demons realize something is going to happen. They then become troublesome and try to thwart it. If you don't stand firm, you make the mistake of going along with their behavior, but you must always persevere. He told us to keep walking, assuring us that he would bring Latifah along later. And indeed, after some time, Latifah came willingly with a smile. I have no idea what rituals they performed, but the fact is that Latifah came along willingly. When she finally arrived at the house, she remained on the yard. She didn't want to go inside and glared angrily in our direction. The man in question looked at us and said she couldn't go inside because a demonic spirit was on her, and his house was protected against it. By now, it was clear to me that something sinister was going on, so I was glad that this man saw it immediately and told us, "I will make her better because I know what's going on." He sent me to the city to buy some products he would work with: a small bottle, a white thread, a piece of white cotton, to buy a new needle. We bought the items and returned immediately. He put the needle in the bottle of colored alcohol, but the thread had to remain dry. I had to smear that colored alcohol with the needle behind her ears, neck, knees, and feet. He said that afterward, we could go home again, but gave us a glass of water with a liquid. "Latifah must drink this," he said. Upon arriving home, my niece and nephew held her hands so I could give her the water. Listeners, it seemed as if she had become incredibly strong because she threw my nephew like a feather into the corner. Once she had cooled down, we tried again. I held the glass with Jasmine behind my back, and my niece undressed her. Then I poured the water over her head and face. I washed her, and that night she walked to bed herself, for the first time in years. Deep down, I was happy because it seemed like we were finally moving in the right direction. She was given a cord that had to remain around her waist, and it had a small ball that had to stay in front of her navel. This cord could only be removed one day after the next full moon. Meanwhile, time passed in Haiti, and I had to return home. The helper begged me to extend my ticket because he wanted to provide aftercare. He wanted to keep an eye on it and said he didn't feel like everything had been resolved yet. Unfortunately, I couldn't stay longer because we had already been away from home for some time, and I had to start working again. The helper gave us a cord to take with us that Latifah had to tie around her waist. This cord had a white ball that had to always remain in front of her navel and could only be removed one day after the next full moon. Once we arrived at Schiphol, the same problems with Latifah arose again. Her mouth was full of saliva that she refused to spit out. My husband became quite angry because we thought we were finally done, and he pinched her cheeks to make her spit it out. We asked what was wrong, But Latifah didn't answer and smiled as if nothing was wrong. Once home, we put Latifah in the shower, and that's when we discovered that she wasn't wearing a white cord. This was impossible because I hadn't let Latifah out of my sight for a second. I dressed her in Haiti myself, and she hadn't gone to the toilet the entire trip. Now, I understood why she wanted us to stay longer, to prevent this from happening. As you may have guessed, with the disappearance of the white cord, all the misery started again. Running away, sitting naked in the house, speaking gibberish. Everything returned, and we were at our wits' end. We decided to have Latifah placed under the care of a psychiatrist. Although we were convinced that there were dark forces at work, this seemed like the best solution to us. We quickly heard that Latifah needed to be admitted because she was only declared 30% accountable. However, I decided not to do this because they couldn't offer 24-hour care in the short term, and given her strange actions, she needed it. What was strange about all this was that my daughter got the same psychiatrist who had to treat the voodoo priest, Andreas, that devilish man, after he was arrested. He immediately knew that this had nothing to do with psychiatric care, but that dark cultural forces were at work. He decided to take over the care and scheduled an appointment with my family. Once at the appointment, we were told that we had to pray for 7 days. For this, we had to prepare a table in the house with a white candle, a glass of water, and a white cloth. We also had to fast for 7 days. No sex, no smoking, no gambling, and no meat. As requested, we did so. During those 7 days, I dreamed of an old man. I was sitting on the balcony, and he suddenly appeared beside me. He opened his hand, and in it was a key. He gave me this key and said that I had to use it before noon. I didn't understand the dream, so I decided to ask our new helper what was going on. He smiled and said that by now it was clear to him what was happening. He asked me if I had enmity with my in-laws, and I confirmed this. It was because my father-in-law had assaulted my daughter in the past, and we only found out about it after 10 years. I never wanted to see these people again. Just talking about it gives me chills all over again. That man was so dark that I didn't speak to him until he died. It also seemed like my in-laws didn't mind what he had done at all. He was always protected by everyone, and his will was law. I was also never allowed to know where he was buried because they thought I would damage his grave. Let's go back to the conversation with our helper. The helper asked me if Latifah was sick when he was still alive, or if this happened after his death. I said he died in June, and Latifah started with strange behavior in mid-July. He looked at me seriously and said, "Your mother and child must go to your father-in-law's grave before Thursday 1 p.m. Make sure you speak there that he has no power over the child and that you are separated from him. Walk away in a straight line and do not turn around no matter what happens. Even if you hear things falling, do not turn around." I didn't know where he was buried, but I called my sister-in-law and told her what was going on. After some discussion, she told me where he was buried, and we left in the morning around 10 a.m. to the cemetery. People from Black horror stories, you won't believe it, but we couldn't find the cemetery. We drove in circles and were sent the wrong way so many times that it was clear to me that dark forces were at work. It was already 12:30, and I knew we had to do this before 1 p.m. I prayed again to God and asked him to help us. stating that we would do nothing wrong, but were looking for a solution. Miraculously, we arrived at the cemetery at exactly 10 minutes to 1 o'clock, and we stood in front of my deceased father-in-law's grave in no time. I had to contain my anger, because if it were up to me, I would have smashed everything. As instructed, we performed the necessary rituals, and everything seemed to go well. We walked away from the grave and heard no sounds. We had prepared ourselves for the worst, but fortunately, it wasn't that bad. On our way back, we passed by Mirtha's grave, the woman who found my daughter dead in her home. As we walked past her grave, Latifah started screaming loudly. It seemed like she was in tremendous pain and couldn't walk any further. She screamed that something was trying to strangle her and that she couldn't breathe. We still had some holy water with us from the priest and smeared it on Latifah's throat when my mother felt the same feeling. Out of breath, she fell to the ground, and as she gasped for air, she told us that something was strangling her. I also smeared the holy water on her neck and kept praying, and praying. Latifah then pointed and said that a woman was laughing at us. I didn't see anything. There was no one there, but Latifah kept pointing and said that the woman had to go away. Was this Mirtha? I would never really know, because I didn't see anything. At one point, they both broke free from the strangulation, and we hurried to the car. At the car, Latifah continued to behave strangely, so we decided to drive to the helper. Once there, my mother and the helper went into a trance and threw Latifah to the ground. I don't know how to explain this, but they made sounds like they were chewing something. You could really hear them biting something, but they didn't touch Latifah. Latifah trembled, and at one point, it seemed like she lost consciousness. I ran to her when the helper shouted not to touch her. He then quickly placed a white sheet over her and spat a certain alcohol over her. I was frozen when Latifah suddenly sat up straight and looked clear-eyed. The helper got up and asked all of us to sit in the living room without Latifah. Latifah was sent to the shower, and we sat in the living room as requested. The helper then told us that unfortunately, Latifah had taken a demon upon herself when she entered Mirtha's house. This demon was sent to kill Mirt and her daughter. But because Latifah walked in for Mirtha's daughter, it jumped on her and saw her as its target. It turned out that during the search of Andreas, the dark voodoo priest's house, nails and hairs of Mirt were found on his altar. These were tied to a packaged baby corpse and a black candle. Apparently, he had worked on her with black magic, and this ultimately became her death. The same fate would have befallen my daughter, Latifah. The police also found multiple baby corpses and attributes indicating black magic. Apparently, multiple people had fallen victim to Andreas's practices. Shocked by the story, we left the helper's house heading home. Once at the car, Latifah seemed fine. When we arrived home, she said she was going to bed because she had to work early in the morning. For your information, Latifah hadn't been working for months. I took it for granted and thought it was good that she went to sleep because it had been a long day. The next morning, Latifah woke up and seemed very clear. She said good morning and asked if I could drop her off at work because she couldn't find her car keys. I was shocked and asked her to come sit down for a moment. We then realized that Latifah's life had stopped at the moment she found Mirt dead in the house. In her mind, That was yesterday, even though it was over 8 months ago. She had no memories of the past time and didn't even know she had lost her job. We then called for psychiatric care, and they came immediately, stating that they would admit her to help her process this calmly. If we had kept her at home, there was a good chance that she would fall into a psychosis due to the confusion. Latifah is doing better now, but unfortunately, she is 100% disabled and can never work again.